Hi. How's everybody this evening? I hope everybody had a good weekend. It's Sunday night, day of rest, right before the week starts over again. So, tonight we are going to start with another uh, book from the Nancy Drew Mystery Series. My name is Sharon Schultz, also known as the Bay Lady. I do a lot of tours in person and virtual around the Chesapeake Bay area of Maryland where I live. And so that's where the Bay Lady comes in. I just love this area and I love sharing all the really nice places that Maryland has to offer. But that's not all I do this morning, or actually earlier this afternoon. I don't know if you caught my chicken cam, but yeah, I went to visit the chickens next door and feed them and whatnot. So that was kind of fun. And then my Nancy Drew series is a little out of the ordinary. I also do little craft things as well. So you never know what you're going to find with the Bay Lady. If you would like to keep up with my travels and my tours, you can find me on Facebook. My page is The Bay Lady, and my YouTube channel is Sharon Schultz, The Bay Lady. You can also find my tours listed on Together Virtually. It's a platform where many of the former Hago guides list their tours and all for those who are interested. Also on my, oh, hey, Ronnie Lynn. I also have on my website a platform called Buy Me a Coffee. And it's so perfect for me because I am a Starbucks addict. But anyway, that's a page, that's a platform where if anybody, wanted to, offer a gratuity or, donation tip, whatever you call it, all of my tours are free. So my expenses, my gas is paid for by the generosity of the people who enjoy my tours. Ta-da. All right. Well, tonight we are going to read The Secret of Shadow Ranch. I don't know if I have read this in my other life, my younger years. I mean, some of the books I do remember. I don't remember this one, though. The reason I selected number 5, up to this point, the stories involve Nancy Drew and her friend Helen Corning, and that is like for maybe the first. Well, yeah, it is the first 4 stories because number 5 is the first one that has her friends Bess and George, and they are, my favorites. What I grew up liking, Bess and George, and oh gosh, Nancy had a boyfriend too, Ned. I don't know if you've seen the Nancy Drew TV series that came out probably 10 years ago by now. I'm sure you can probably find it on digital, the digital formats. But it's a different twist on Nancy Drew. I was kind of surprised when I saw it. Nancy Drew, keep in mind, these books were written in they started in the 1930s and went into the 1940s and 50s and on for several decades. But the values and the events and the culture when these books were written corresponded to the times. Okay, so it was kind of interesting in the Nancy Drew television series where Nancy's boyfriend Ned, he's a little bit more worldly than the Ned in the book. Her friends, Bess and George, definitely more worldly, and it was just so different, but it fit. It fit. I liked the series. It was good. But enough of that. Let's read The Secret of Shadow Ranch. Okay. Secret of Shadow Ranch by Carolyn Keene. Let's see. This book was written 1931 was his first printing. 1931. Can you imagine life in 1931? Okay. The Secret of Shadow Ranch. Chapter 1, A Curious Stranger. Here I am, girls, exclaimed Nancy Drew as she hugged her two best friends, all set for an exciting vacation at Shadow Ranch. I hope you had a good flight, said Bess Marvin. The pretty, slightly plump blonde was not smiling as usual. Nancy wondered why. Are we glad to see you? Remarked George Fane, an attractive, tomboyish girl with dark hair, short. She glanced anxiously around the crowded waiting room in the Phoenix Air Terminal. Let's go where we can talk. Nancy looked at the cousins with keen blue eyes. What's the matter? Is something wrong? Bess bit her lip and then burst out, Oh, Nancy, we can't stay. We have to go home tomorrow. But why? Nancy asked, astonished. Because there's a mystery at the ranch, George said bluntly, and Uncle Ed thinks it's not safe for us to be here. Bess put in, but Nancy, if you could convince Uncle Ed you can solve the case, maybe he'd let us stay. However, I'm not so sure I want to. It's kind of pretty frightening. I can't wait to hear what the mystery is, Nancy said excitedly. George insisted on collecting Nancy's suitcases at the baggage claim section. But save the mystery until I come back, George said, and hastened off. Bess led Nancy toward an attractive sandwich shop in the air terminal. On the way, admiring glances were cast at the two girls. Tighten-haired Nancy was a trim figure in her olive green knit with matching shoes. Beige accessories and knitting bag complemented her costume. Bess wore a pale blue cotton, which showed off her deep suntan to advantage. While they talked and walked, Bess explained that her uncle had decided at breakfast to send the girls home. At his insistence, George had made reservations for a flight the next day. We told him what a wonderful detective you are and begged him to let you try to solve the mystery. He said it was too dangerous for a girl. George phoned you, but you'd already left, Bess sighed. It's a shame. We could have had a super vacation. The three girls had grown up together in River Heights and had shared many exciting adventures. Several weeks before, Bess and George's aunt and uncle, Edward and Elizabeth Raleigh, owners of Shadow Ranch, had invited them to spend the summer in Arizona. The Raleighs had easily been persuaded to include Nancy in the invitation. Nancy's father, Carson Drew, a famous lawyer, had given his consent to the trip, but had asked his daughter to delay her departure for a week in order to do some work for him. Previously, Nancy had helped him solve the secret of the old clock. It was her first case and had led to many other assignments, the most recent of which was the mystery at Lilac Inn. Now the young sleuth was eager to hear about the mystery at Shadow Ranch. She and Bess strolled into the sandwich shop and made their way among the crowded tables to a small one in a corner. As they seated themselves, a slender gray haired man in a tank suit sat down on the next table. As down at the next table, Nancy placed her knitting bag on the floor between his chair and her own. "What are you making?" Bess asked, nodding towards the bag. "A sweater for Dad," Nancy replied. "I hope to finish it for his birthday. Originally, I bought the wool for myself, but he admired the color, so I decided to surprise him and knit a sweater for him. You think he'll like the style?" "He'll love it. Not to change the subject, but there are some handsome cowboys at the ranch," Bess remarked, as she told Nancy of the fun she and George had been having. Bess grew more cheerful. Just then George joined them. Besides the brown linen purse that matched her dress, she now carried a big thermos jug. "I had a porter put your bags in the car," she told Nancy, "and I bought this thermos back. We have to fill it with water for the drive across the desert. We started with 2 jugs. Bess and I drank up the water in one on the way here." When the waitress came to take the girls' order, Nancy and George chose soft drinks while Bess studied the menu. "This mystery has me so upset," she declared, "that my appetite is gone." Then she added, "I'll have a double chocolate sundae with walnuts." Nancy and George grinned. "Poor girl," said George. "She's just wasting away." Bess looked sheepish. "Never mind me," she said. "Start telling Nancy about the mystery." George tugged her chair closer and bent forward. "About 2 months ago," she began, "Uncle Ed and Aunt Bet acquired Shadow Ranch in payment of a debt. They always wanted to be ranchers, so they moved here and began working the property. But for the past month, there have been so many accidents, they've decided the ranch is being sabotaged. At first, they weren't sure." Bess took up the story. "But after last night, Uncle Ed said there was no doubt." "What happened?" Nancy asked. "The phantom horse appeared," replied George. And Nancy's eyes sparkled with interest. "A phantom? Tell me." Bess shivered. "It's the weirdest thing, all glowy white and filming. We saw it running across what we call the big meadow." George added, "Shorty Steele, he's one of the ranch hands, said it's supposed to be the ghost of the horse which belonged to Dirk Valentine, an old-time outlaw. There's a very romantic legend about him," Bess said. "He was the sweetheart of Frances Humber, daughter of the local sheriff, who was the original owner of Shadow Ranch. One night, when Dirk Valentine came there to see Francis, the sheriff shot and killed him. As he lay dying, the desperado put a curse on the Humber property, vowing that his horse would haunt Shadow Ranch, and whenever it appeared, destruction would follow." "That curse came true," George said grimly. "This morning, Uncle Ed found one of his windmills had been pulled down." Nancy looked thoughtful. "Did the phantom horse make any sound?" "No," replied George, "but just before it appeared, we heard a weird whistle. The ranchers say the outlaw always called his horse that way." "The phantom horse must be a trick, of course," Nancy said. "It sounds as if someone is trying to scare your aunt and uncle off their property." As she spoke, Nancy became aware that the man at the next table was listening intently to the conversation. But why? Bess broke off as she felt Nancy's foot nudge hers under the table. George caught Nancy's warning glance and also understood. Just then, the waitress brought their order, and the girls chatted lightly of other subjects. When they finished and their check came, Nancy reached for her knitting bag and gave a cry of alarm. "What's the matter?" Bess asked. "My bag. I can't find it." George exclaimed, "I bet that man who sat next to us took it. He's gone too." The three girls jumped up and looked around, but the man was not in sight. George hurried outside to see if she can find him. Nancy, meanwhile, looked on the floor nearby. Under the far side of the man's table lay the knitting bag. Quickly, Nancy retrieved it. "See if anything's missing," Bess advised. "Maybe your wallet's gone." Nancy made a search, but as far as she can tell, the original contents were intact. However, their arrangement seemed to be different. Had the man been snooping? And if so, why? Bess paid the check and the girls walked to the door. They met George coming in. "Didn't see him anywhere," she said. "Guess he drove off, the thief." George stopped short. "Nancy, you have your bag." Nancy grinned. "Thanks for your help anyway." "I still don't like old eavesdropper," George declared. As the girls walked through the terminal, Nancy stopped at a row of telephone booths. "Wait a minute," she said. "I promised to call home and let Hannah know when I arrived here." Bess volunteered to fill the thermos jug while Nancy phoned. "Give my love to Hannah," she called back as she hurried off. "Mine too," said George as Nancy entered the phone booth. Mrs. Hannah Gruen was the Drews' warm-hearted housekeeper who had looked after Nancy since her mother's death when she was 3. She and Nancy held a deep affection for each other. Soon, Hannah's cheerful voice came over the wire. "Don't worry about anything here, Nancy," she said. "Just enjoy yourself." By the time Nancy hung up, Bess had returned. "I didn't tell Hannah I might be right home," Nancy reported. "She's going to get a big surprise when we turn up tomorrow," George remarked gloomily. Nancy smiled. "Not if I can persuade your uncle to change his mind." As the girls stepped from the cool building, the afternoon sun was dazzling. Waves of heat shimmered over the parked cars. George led the way back past several lines of cars, then turned into a row and walked towards an old ranch wagon. As the girls drew nearer, they exclaimed in surprise. A man was dropping something through the open window of the car. He was the eavesdropper who had sat beside them. "Hey, what are you doing?" George called. The stranger glanced up, startled, then darted away among the cars. Nancy dashed to the ranch wagon, with the girls close behind her. There was a piece of paper on the seat. Nancy picked it up. A note. In crudely penciled letters, it said, "Keep away from Shadow Ranch." "Come on," Nancy explained. "We must catch that man and find out what this means." Okay, this is interesting, right? They're talking about, let's see, there were a couple of things I saw that I thought, oh, the phone booth, right? Telephone booth. Anybody remember those? And also when she was talking about how hot it was, they probably didn't have air conditioning, I venture to say. Chapter 2, Dangerous Surprises. The girls sped off in the direction the man had fled. At the end of the row of cars, they paused to look right and left. There he is, Nancy exclaimed. The man was hastening towards the terminal. He looked back, then broke into a run. Nancy and George sprinted ahead and saw him dash into the building. The girls followed, dodging people and baggage carts, but the fugitive had disappeared among the crowd. Where is he? Bess panted as she caught up to them. Gone, George said tersely. No use looking for him in here. But Nancy hadn't given up. Their dash into the terminal had excited curious stares from passers-by and a newsstand attendant. Did you ever see that man before? She asked the clerk behind the news counter. The one we were chasing? No, he said. What happened? Did he steal something? Shall I call the police? Oh, no, thank you, said Nancy, but I'd like to find out who he is. Nancy returned to the cousins after questioning some people nearby, but none of them had ever seen the man before. I'm afraid that's that, she told them. As they left the building, Nancy realized that she was still holding the note and tucked it into her knitting bag. One thing we learned, she said as they crossed the parking lot again, whoever the man is, he's connected with the mystery at the ranch. But why should he want to keep us away from there? Bess asked. Perhaps for the same reason someone wants to drive your aunt and uncle off the property. When they reached the ranch wagon, Nancy volunteered to drive. George agreed and acted as her guide through the streets of Phoenix. As they left the outskirts, the road stretched before them like an endless white ribbon, with brown desert on either side as far as the eye could see. Here and there were dark clumps of sage and saltgrass. Beyond, on the horizon, lay the hazy blue shapes of mountains. That's where we're headed, partner, George said with a grin. 150 miles of the hottest, thirstiest ride you ever took. For a while, cars passed the girls from both directions, but then they grew fewer and fewer. Bess, who had been unusually silent, spoke up. What I can't figure out is why anyone would want to take Shadow Ranch from Uncle Ed. It's in very poor condition. George agreed. It almost seems as if Dirk Valentine's curse has worked. She told Nancy that shortly after the outlaw's death, Sheriff Huber's fortunes had begun to fail. He had been forced to sell the ranch section by section. One large part was now state property, on which old Indian cliff dwellings still stood. Finally, Humber had lost the property altogether. The next owner had tried to build it up, but suffered bad luck too. Others had followed, and the ranch had fallen into a worse state of disrepair. Ed Raleigh had been obliged to sink a lot of money in the place, trying to get it into running condition. Nancy had listened thoughtfully. The property must have some hidden value, she said, if somebody wants it so badly now. For a while, the girls rode without speaking. The wind had risen, and the rush of it past the open windows, combined with the roar of the motor, made conversation difficult. Suddenly, Bess gave a sharp exclamation. Nancy, we completely forgot to tell you about Alice. George slapped her forehead. Good night. What brains are we? Alice who? Said Nancy. Our cousin Alice Rigger. She's 14, Bess replied. She's staying at Shadow Ranch too. That is, she hopes she's staying, George amended. If we go home, she'll have to leave too. I feel sorry for her, Beth said. She has a special reason for being here, and she's hoping you can help her, Nancy. Me? Nancy exclaimed. How? Well, we've told her about you, Bess confessed. We told her what a good detective you are. Nancy laughed. Now, Bess, you know you don't have to butter me up. Just tell me, what is Alice's mystery? Bess smiled. I knew you'd try to help. George explained. Alice's father is missing. He's been gone almost 6 months. She said that Ross Reger had been president of a bank in a suburb of Chicago where he lived with his family. Someone reported having seen him enter the bank on the night it was robbed. Mr. Reger had not been seen since. Some of the newspapers implied that he was in league with the gang, Bess said, but naturally none of his family or friends believed that. From the way the burglar alarm was tampered with, George said, the police were able to identify the gang easily. A few days later, one of them was spotted in Phoenix but eluded capture. Because of that, Alice thinks the gang is hiding out in the area holding her father captive. Or if he was released, he's wandering around here a victim of amnesia. Nancy was instantly sympathetic. That's not much to go on, but I'll do my best. During the past 5 minutes, the wind had been increasing, and Nancy was using considerable strength to keep the wheel steady. Suddenly, a brown swirling cloud of sand arose ahead of them. Sandstorm, she cried, close the windows. Her words were lost as the wind shrieked and a stinging flash of sand hit their faces. While Nancy fought to hold the car on the road, Bess leaned over in back of her and managed to roll up the window. George closed the one on her side. Nancy applied the brakes, and the girl sat silent, astounded by the suddenness of the storm. The wind screamed, and the sand shifted through the cracks around the doors and windows. The car rocked, but stayed upright. Wow, said George, this desert is full of surprises. Fearful ones, Bess added. After an agonizing wait, the wind gradually died and the sand settled enough to permit the girls to see the red glow of the sun. Quickly, they opened the doors and stepped outside. Ooh, said Bess, shaking her hair. I have sand in my hair. When they had brushed their clothes, Bess took one of the jugs from the back of the ranch wagon. Quickly, she poured water into paper cups for all of them. Nancy drank hers thirstily. Good old water, she said with a sigh. It was wonderful the way you held the car on the road, Bess said, helping herself to a second cup. Right, said George. If we'd gone into the soft stand, we would have been stranded. Nancy looked over the empty desert and shook her head. How awful it must have been for the pioneers, she said. Imagine riding out here for days in a bumping wagon, or worse, walking in the burning sun. With every drop of water precious, Bess said. They ran out of it too sometimes, George said soberly. Uncle Ed told us that the bones of pioneers and abandoned wagons have been found in many places around here. Well, that's a ghastly thought, Bess remarked, and there was silence for a while. Finally, Nancy said, if I read the mileage right, we have about an hour's drive yet. She poured some water from the thermos into her clean handkerchief and wiped her face and hands. Excuse me. George and Bess did the same. Then the girls combed their hair and put on fresh lipstick. Bess giggled. I don't know why we bother. There's no one out here to see us but prairie dogs and lizards. Cheer up, said Nancy. You'll soon be back among all those handsome cowboys. George poured the remaining water from the thermos into a cup and offered it to the others. Nancy and Bess declined, so George drank it herself. The girls got into the car, and Nancy turned the key in the ignition. The engine started at once. You don't know how glad I am to hear that, she confessed. I was afraid sand might have clogged the motor. As the car rolled along, Nancy said, I've been thinking about the mystery of Shadow Ranch. Tell me more of the windmill episode. If somebody tore it down, there'd have been a tremendous racket. Didn't the Raleighs hear it? No, said George. And the mill wasn't torn down. Uncle Ed figures from tire tracks and bumper dents that someone used the ranch truck, drove to the east meadow without lights, and backed hard into the windmill a few times. Over it went. That night there was a howling storm, so, of course, no one heard the noise. Nancy frowned. Aren't there any dogs on the ranch? Surely they'd have barked. Bess bobbed her head. The Raleighs have a fine watchdog. There wasn't a peep out of them. Besides, the east meadow is some distance from the ranch building. Then, Nancy said, the whole thing must have been an inside job. The dog knows the person or persons who did this. Have you noticed anything suspicious about the ranch hands? Bess and George said all the men seemed very nice. But then, George added, I suppose they'd be careful to avoid suspicion. Well, Nancy, you can see you have a job ahead of you. If Uncle Ed will let us stay, Bess said. Say, is it my imagination, or isn't it getting hotter in this wagon? She mopped her forehead with a handkerchief. Better start on the second jug of water. As Bess turned around to reach for it, Nancy glanced at the temperature gauge. Oh no, she exclaimed. We're overheating. Grimly, she slowed down and stopped. The girls climbed out. Bess leaned into the car and released the lock of the hood. Nancy and George, using handkerchiefs on the hot metal, tried to lift it. At first, the hood stuck, then suddenly flew up. Look out, warned Nancy, unscrewing the radiator cap. She jumped back, pulling George with her as steam and boiling water sprouted from the radiator. Are you all right? Bess asked anxiously as she hurried towards them. I am. How about you, George? I'm okay, said George, brushing the moisture from her face and short cropped hair. Just what I didn't need, a hot bath. Good thing we didn't drink that other jug of water, Nancy said. We'll need it for the radiator now. There must be a leak in it, George said, looking worried. The water will run right through. Well, it can't be too bad, Nancy reasoned. After all, we came a long way before trouble started. That's right, George conceded. We should be able to make it to the ranch. She went to the back of the ranch wagon and quickly returned with the thermos jug. She removed the top and handed the jug to Nancy, who tilted it over the radiator. Not a drop came out. Chapter 3, Warning Rattle. We're stranded, Bess exclaimed in dismay. George stared at the empty thermos jug unbelievingly. It can't be, said George. Shorty Steele promised to fill that jug with water. He must have forgotten, said Bess. She peered up and down the road, but there was no vehicle in sight. Nancy tried to sound unworried as she spoke. We might as well get in the car and wait for the water in the radiator to cool off. Or maybe someone will come along and help us. She replaced the radiator cap. If we're not at the ranch for supper, Uncle Ed or someone will drive out to look for us, Bess remarked hopefully. Time dragged by as the girls waited. Nancy tested the water twice. It was still boiling hot. They might have to wait until evening. And she was not keen about driving in a strange desert after dark. It's like an oven in this wagon, Bess complained. It's hotter outside, George mumbled. Suddenly, the girls spotted a speck moving towards them on the dusty road. With relief, the girls watched it take shape as a pickup truck. It's from the ranch, George yelled and dashed outside. Bess followed, and when the truck stopped, she cried out, Dave Gregory, you're a lifesaver. I was about to die of thirst and sunstroke. With a grin, the tall cowboy swung down from the truck cab. Quickly, Bess introduced him to Nancy. Dave's handsome face grew stern when Bess and George explained what had happened. He pushed his hat to the back of his head, hooked his thumbs in his belt, and said, just what I figured. 3 little dudes stuck high and dry. Mr. Raleigh warned you to check your water supply before you went out on the desert. But Shorty promised he'd take care of it, said George. Dave's eyes narrowed for an instant, and then he said casually, well, this is dangerous country. You check your own gear if you know what's good for you. We're sorry you had to come out after us, Nancy apologized. Mr. Raleigh's orders, he said coldly, and strode to the truck. In a minute, Dave was back with a large can and a thermos jug, which he handed to the girls. While they drank, he poured water from the can into the radiator of the ranch wagon. He put back the cap and slammed the hood. The girls returned the jug and thanked him. Dave gave a curt nod and walked to his truck and swung aboard. By the time Nancy had the car started, the pickup had turned around and gone roaring down the road ahead of them. What's eating him? George burst out. He was about as friendly to you, Nancy, as a prairie dog. Nancy smiled. Never mind. I can see his point. She worried, however, what the trouble was. She had not even reached the ranch, and already two people had been mysterious and unfriendly to her. She followed the truck down the highway and finally onto a road which wound through the barren hills at the foot of the mountains. It was nearly sunset when the girls entered a rocky pass and came out high above a valley. At the far side loomed a huge mountain with a group of low buildings nestled at its foot. Bess pointed to them. There's the ranch, and that's Shadow Mountain. I see how they got their name, said Nancy. The great peak throws its shadow over the whole valley. Half an hour later, they drove through a weather-beaten wooden gate into the ranch yard. Nancy pulled up to the ranch house, a long one-story adobe building with a vine-covered uh, portico across the front. To the north of the house were the corral and the stable. Beyond these stretched a large meadow bordered by a wire fence. In the opposite direction lay the bunkhouse, and south of this, some distance away, a smaller enclosed meadow. In it, cattle were grazing. A stocky, sunburned man and a dark-haired woman hurried out to meet the girls as they alighted. Bess, George, exclaimed Elizabeth Raleigh. We were so worried, and this must be Nancy. We're very glad to see you, dear. She gave her guest a hug and a smile, but the girl could see a strained look in her eyes. Mr. Raleigh took Nancy's hand in his large one and said cordially, I'm mighty glad to know you. And I'm glad to be here, Nancy replied. Her host gathered the suitcases and led the way toward the house. Suddenly, Nancy heard ferocious barking and turned to see a huge black dog bounding towards her. Behind him ran Dave Gregory. Chief, he shouted, come back here. With a snarl, the dog stopped short and began circling Nancy, snapping and barking. She did not move, and the animal grew calmer. Then, as she spoke to him softly, he sniffed her hand. Moments later, Nancy was stroking his thick fur. He was a handsome black German shepherd, the largest Nancy had ever seen. The others had been looking on in amazement. Young lady, said Ed Raleigh, I like the way you stood your ground. How about it, Dave? Pretty good for a tenderfoot, the cowboy admitted, then said, come along, Chief. Your job is chasing coyotes away from the chickens. Obediently, the dog trotted away toward the far end of the yard. The dog's full name is Apache Chief, said Elizabeth Raleigh, as she led the girls onto the portico. Just then, a slender girl with dark curly hair and big, sad-looking eyes stepped from the house. Bess introduced her as their cousin Alice. She said hello to Nancy and shyly followed the others along the portico to Bess and George's room, which Nancy was to share. Another door led into the main hallway of the house. Mr. Raleigh followed with the luggage. When the travelers had showered and put on fresh dresses, they heard a loud clanging from outside. That's cook ringing for supper, Alice explained to Nancy. The girls hurried off to the kitchen at the far end of the house. Outside the screen door hung an iron triangle, still swinging. The big room was crowded with men who stood around a long oval table with a red checkered tablecloth on it. Nancy was introduced to a tall, thin man with sun-bleached hair. "This is Walt Sanders, my foreman," said Mr. Raleigh, "and some of my men." Sanders shook Nancy's hand. Shorty Steele, a husky, middle-aged cowboy, did the same. Next, a good-looking, red-haired cowboy was introduced as Tex Britton, and his dark-haired pal as Bud Moore. With a glance, Bess informed Nancy that these two were the nice cowboys she had told her about. "Grub's ready," called a high, shrill voice. "Everybody sit down." A small woman with frizzy gray hair and a white apron bustled from the stove to the table, bearing a big platter of steaming meat. "This is Mrs. Thurmond, our cook," said the ranch owner's wife. In the confusion of taking seats, George had a chance to ask Shorty about the water he had promised to put in the station wagon. The cowboy's sun-tanned face showed surprise. "No, ma'am, I never said I'd do that," he declared. "You must have mistook my meaning." He repeated the denial several times. Nancy overheard Shorty and thought he was overdoing it. She wondered if the misunderstanding might not have been part of a plan to scare the girls away from the ranch. After serving a hearty meal of roast beef, beans, corn fritters, and salad, Mrs. Thurmond produced two large, delicious apple pies. When the last bite had been eaten, Ed Raleigh arose and there was silence. "Okay, men," he said briskly, "who has the first watch?" Okay. "Okay, men," he said brusquely, "who has first watch?" "Me and Dave," replied Shorty, and the two left the kitchen together. Quietly, the rest of the men arose, and Mrs. Raleigh let the girls through a door into a large living room. Like the kitchen, it ran from the front to the back of the house. Among the comfortable furnishings were several slim, old-fashioned rockers and a round center table with a brass lamp on it. Bright-colored Indian rugs lay on the floor. At one end of the room was a large stone fireplace. "Tradition says that all the rocks in it have come from Shadow Ranch," Alice told Nancy. She pointed out a smooth, round one. "That's an Indian grinding stone." At the opposite end of the room, beside a door leading to the portico, was a deep window. In front of it, on shelves, stood rows of colored antique bottles. "This is lovely," Nancy exclaimed. "We're sorry you can't stay to enjoy it," Mrs. Raleigh said as her husband entered from the kitchen. "Yes," he said, "but it's too dangerous. We're under attack and we can't figure out by whom or why. I only know that if the damage keeps on, we won't be able to stand the expense. We'll lose Shadow Ranch. Mrs. Raleigh explained that the sheriff could not spare a man to be a full-time guard at the ranch, so her husband and the hands took turns standing watch. Perhaps you have enemies who want revenge on you, Nancy suggested. Or maybe your property has hidden value. The owner replied that he could think of nothing to support either theory. Nancy then described the man at the airport and told what had happened. The notes in your knitting bag, Bess spoke. I'll get it. She hurried to the girl's room and returned with Nancy's knitting bag. The young sleuth took out the note and crossed the room to give it to the rancher. Bess started to close the bag. Instead, she idly picked up the half-finished sweater. Underneath it lay a small object loosely wrapped in dirty brown paper. What's this, Nancy? She asked. As she lifted it, the wrapping fell off. For a moment, Bess stared at the thing in her hand, then gave a little cry and flung it from her. Nancy hurried to pick up the object. The rattle from a snake, she said, holding it up for the others to see. Oh, exclaimed Alice. Nancy retrieved the wrapping paper. There was penciled writing on it. Second warning, she read out loud. Nancy turned to the grim-faced ranch owner and his wife. Now more than ever, she said earnestly, I want to solve this mystery. Won't you let me stay and help you? The rancher looked at her pleading expression and smiled. We certainly could use a detective. And I've got to hand it to you, Nancy. You sure can keep your head. He glanced at his wife. What do you say, Bet? Elizabeth Rowley nodded soberly. All right, the girls may stay, but they must promise to be very careful. Eagerly, they agreed, and George hastened to the telephone in the hall to cancel the plane reservations which he had made. In the meantime, Mr. Raleigh said he thought the notes and the snake rattle should be taken to the sheriff the next morning. Excuse me. I'll go, Mr. Raleigh, said Nancy. Maybe I should meet him. When George returned, Mrs. Raleigh was saying, Nancy, I think you should call us Aunt Bet and Uncle Ed. After all, you'll be one of our family. Nancy smiled. I'd love that, Aunt Bet. I wish you were going to work on my mystery, too, Alice said wistfully. Nancy took the young girl's hand. Of course I will, she said kindly, and Alice's blue eyes lit up. Nancy told the Raleighs that she would like to get started with her sleuthing immediately. May I question your men about the phantom horse? Yes, indeed, Ed Raleigh agreed. One after another, the ranch hands were summoned, but none of them could add anything to the information Bess and George had given Nancy. All of these men are new here, Mr. Raleigh told her after they'd gone, but Walt Sanders, Tex, and Bud are from an outfit in the next county. Dave's from Montana, and Shorty's a drifter. After a little more talk, Beth stifled a yawn and then suggested that the girls go to bed. She led the way out a side door and down a hall to their rooms. Alice went into the next one. Before long, Bess and George were asleep, but Nancy lay wide-eyed, wondering about Dave Gregory. Why was he so hostile to her? Could he be one of the saboteurs? And what about Shorty? Was he to be trusted? Finally, Nancy fell asleep. Just after midnight, she awoke suddenly, startled by a noise on the portico. She sensed someone pausing at the door to listen. Then the footsteps moved on. Now, what was that about? Nancy asked herself. Quickly she rose, put on robe and slippers, and cautiously opened the screen door. No one was nearby, but at the far end of the portico, she saw a dark figure slip into the kitchen. Why would anyone be going in there from outdoors at this time of night? Nancy asked herself. I'd better find out. She wondered if she should awaken the other girls, but decided against this and tiptoed along the portico to the kitchen. She opened the door and stepped inside the dark room. The next instant, an unearthly shriek split the air, and someone seized her. And I'm going to make you wait till next week to find out what happens next. All right, that worked out well. With the last book, it worked out as well. I am able to read 3 chapters in an hour. And we just finished chapter 3, and we're 3 minutes short of an hour. So, pretty cool. Yes, yes. All right, folks. Well, we'll be back next week. Same time, same station, same book, different chapter. All right, take care. I'll see you all later this week. Got Beatles trivia on Wednesday. And I've got a virtual tour on Thursday, but I don't remember which one it is. Anywho, y'all have a good evening now. Good night.